Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're here with Dr. Mark Madison, and I'm going to turn it over to our programs chair, Terry Piper, to introduce. Can't hear you, Terry. Muted. Muted. Can't hear you, Terry.
Thank you. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Mark Madison, was the first historian hired by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1999. Dr. Madison helps coordinate all national heritage outreach at the National Conservation Training Center Museum and Archives in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. He manages more than 500,000 objects there. Before the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Dr. Madison spent 3 years doing tropical reforestation in the Philippines for the U.S. Peace Corps and was on the faculty at Harvard University and the University of Melbourne in Australia. In this program for the Orange Audubon Society, Dr. Madison will present a brief history of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the importance of archiving history. Welcome, Dr. Madison. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I've had nothing but computer problems all day. So if I conk out, don't take it personally. It's just a federal computer that's been updated beyond its capacity. So it's great to be able to speak to you, even virtually. And my dog is very excited to be with you all too. Dixie is a very participatory beagle. I'm doing my best to control. But as Terry and Deborah told you, I'm actually the historian for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And this year we turned 150 years, which gives us the great pleasure of using the word sesquicentennial. We don't get to use very often. And I thought what would be fun with you guys is to talk briefly about our agency and its role in Florida. Focusing on your lovely state, where I wish I could be right now, but of course with travel and everything, it's been challenging. But I thought that would be fun to talk a little about Florida, which really was in some ways a cradle for conservation, which people don't normally think about. If they think about where conservation started, they might think Yellowstone or Yosemite, not necessarily right outside Orlando or some of the places we're going to look at today. So I thought that'd be fun. I'll give you a little presentation. Hopefully we'll have some fun pictures from my archives. And then I'd be more than happy to take any questions you might have afterwards. So without further ado, let me switch and try to share my PowerPoint with you. There it is. So far, so good. Can you see my PowerPoint? Is it working?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
And is my face hidden now, I hope?
And hiding right now. And so take it away. Thank you so much.
Perfect. All right. Well, let me just tell you a little story. And like I said, I'd be happy to take any questions. I'll have to do it after the PowerPoint because on my son's computer, which I'm using this evening, all I can see is my PowerPoint. So I'll give you a little history and we'll have a little fun. And then we'll take any questions you might have. So I kind of changed the title as I was working on this over the last week or so and made it The War for Wildlife, which sounds a little melodramatic, I understand, but is accurate. Florida really was a hotbed, a battle to save our nation's wildlife. And what was happening in the very early 20th century could be seen as a war with Florida as the battlefield. And in fact, if we think about it, if this battle had been lost, we wouldn't be here tonight enjoying this wonderful presentation with the Audubon. And so I'm going to go back and look at this turbulent period. So to start with, it might be noted that if you wanted to save America's wildlife, Florida was a hell of a place to try to do it. There were many challenges in the state of Florida around the early 20th century, the late 1900s. Now, as you all probably know, Florida possesses some of the most valuable, but also the most vulnerable wildlife in the US. And in fact, it witnessed exponential human population growth in an area sensitive to any disruption of ecological functions. So these are two really tough factors in Florida, yet in spite of these factors, or maybe because of them, the state was in many ways the origin point for the American conservation movement. So how did this begin? Well, Florida was the center point of the plume trade, and that was driving feathered fashion. And to tell you what that means is from 1880s to 1900 was the peak of the plume trade in the US, where ladies' fashion put a premium on brightly plumed birds, and Florida was the site of the greatest destruction of birds for fashion. Feathers of the day were literally worth their weight in gold, and converting birds to bullion was a major economic driver in the state at the end of the 1800s. At the same time, and related to this, it was a period of rampant market hunting to sell various edible birds to urban markets. So there were two pressures. There was a fashionable pressure, and then there was the pressure to engage in what was called market hunting. You'd shoot a bunch of birds, and then you'd ship them to New York or Chicago for fancy restaurants. This was an era when a number of bird species were in serious decline, most famously the passenger pigeon, which went extinct in 1914, in spite of being the most populous avian species probably to ever live on the planet. So it was a striking cautionary tale, and the future held out a silent spring or a birdless landscape. Luckily, this grim prospect led to the creation of some of the first wildlife warriors and the nation's oldest conservation group, of which you are an offshoot, the Audubon Society. In 1886, the nation's oldest conservation group, the Audubon Society, was founded. And you have to like the fact that the Audubon Society was founded by George Bird Grinnell. So it was founded by a magazine publisher whose middle name was Bird. So that was founded in 1886, and not long after, in 1900, the Florida Audubon Society was formed. And the Florida Audubon Society had two important officers. It had future President Theodore Roosevelt and ornithologist at the American Museum of Natural History, Frank Chapman. So not only was there a chapter in Florida, but the Florida Audubon Society actually had two of the most important conservationists, who you'll see in a minute. These early conservationists began petitioning for the first federal laws to protect birds and other wildlife. Frank Chapman, in particular, went around with an urgent plea for birds, and it might be hard for you to read this old magazine article from 1897. So I'll tell you what the headline is. Chapman, who was influential in starting the Florida Audubon Society and conserving birds in Florida, has an article headlined "The Urgent Plea for Birds," and beneath it, it says, "The vanity of women are blamed." Frank Chapman shows the deplorable results of bird slaughter, and then Dr. Van Dyke talks about the sentimental side of the question. So it was a talk they gave in 1897, basically blaming vanity for the loss of all these birds because of the plume trade. Well, Chapman, along with other ornithologists, helped pass the first wildlife legislation in 1900, the Lacey Act. And my agency, Fish and Wildlife Service, is in charge of the Lacey Act. It was really a four-sided piece of legislation that banned interstate trade in most wildlife, helping protect birds, and much of the plume trade and much of market hunting. So Florida Audubon played a huge role in the very first wildlife conservation law at the federal level. Unfortunately, passing a law was easier than enforcing it, especially as regards poachers working in the Everglades or other remote parts of Florida. And this is a picture from the turn of the century of egrets that were confiscated by law enforcement agents in my agency. Because it was so hard to reach these remote areas, in 1902, Audubon hired their first warden in Florida, a fellow named Guy Bradley, who became the first Audubon warden in the state to protect defenseless Floridian birds. He was soon joined by this fellow who will turn up later in our story, Paul Kregel, and then the other Audubon wardens were hired. So actually a private organization hired these bird wardens to try to protect these defenseless birds, but poaching was only part of the problem. Not surprisingly, habitat destruction was also decimating birds in rapidly growing Florida. Now, Chapman had been a frequent visitor to Florida, and Audubon warden Paul Kregel had pointed out that Pelican Island was a famous rookery on the Indian River near Sebastian, Florida. In fact, Pelican Island was such a famous rookery that John James Audubon had gone down there in 1831 to shoot a slew of pelicans for his later famous paintings. Well, 70 years later, in 1903, on his friend Frank Chapman's advice, President Theodore Roosevelt began a bold experiment, an environmental experiment, if you will, creating the first bird reservation at Pelican Island. Now, this was relatively new. Setting aside habitat exclusively for wildlife hadn't been tried before in the US or elsewhere, and so this was something new under the sun. So Roosevelt created the first unit of what would become the National Wildlife Refuge System at Pelican Island, and we were very fortunate that Roosevelt was such a keen birder himself. He was an avid ornithologist who loved nothing more than going to these types of islands and birding himself. So former Audubon warden and Floridian Paul Kregel became the first federal bird warden, and he was paid an exorbitant salary of $1 a month. And he more than earned his salary using his quick boat and a 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun to eliminate all poaching on Pelican Island. And this is a image from 1903. He put up a little sign on there that said U.S. reservation, keep off. Roosevelt was so happy about the success he had at Pelican Island that he ended up establishing 10 bird reservations in Florida. And by the end of his presidency in 1909, Roosevelt had created 51 bird reservations, with Florida by far having the largest number of them. These Roosevelt refuges were the predecessors of what would eventually become the National Wildlife Refuge System, the largest system of public lands for wildlife in the world. But I get ahead of myself, as Florida had a few more conservation challenges to meet. First, wildlife work remained extremely dangerous. As I mentioned before, Guy Bradley, the first Audubon warden in Florida, was actually killed in 1905, and another Audubon warden, Columbus McLeod, was killed 3 years later by poachers. The loss of Florida's largest egret colony in 1916 renewed urgent attempts to add further protection for migratory birds at the national level. The Florida Audubon Society, including prominent officers like T.S. Palmer, lobbied hard for a new idea, a migratory bird treaty. And Florida Audubon Society officer Palmer even wrote much of the wording for this path-breaking legislation. The 1916 Migratory Bird Treaty was the first environmental treaty ever in the world. It protected most non-game migratory birds, like many of the brightly plumed Floridian avians, and it also established federal supremacy in wildlife laws, which helped protect birds in places like Florida, where sometimes in the early 1900s, the state courts were reluctant to mete out harsh penalties to poachers who might be neighbors or relatives. So by 1916, there were protections on the books. There were federal protections for birds, and there were federal game wardens, or sometimes they were called wildlife protectors, out there to protect the birds. But there was still another problem. There were other challenges in Florida, namely the Florida land boom. That great ecological hotspot of the Everglades had been slowly drained since 1905 to produce new land for development. The great Florida land boom of the 20s increased the rate of draining and devastation to this great natural ecosystem. The destruction of the Everglades was chronicled by former Miami Herald reporter Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Her 1947 bestseller, The Everglades River of Grass, sold over 500,000 copies and helped kick off the environmental movement. 15 years before Rachel Carson's more famous Silent Spring, Douglas had awakened the public to the danger of humanity's impact on the environment and its unheeded manipulation of the environment. 1 month after Douglas's book was published, Everglades National Park was dedicated. There's all sorts of pioneering things going on in the 20th century in Florida. On the Gulf side of Florida, efforts were being begun to protect Sanibel Island by the head of the Bureau of Biological Survey, that's the predecessor of the Fish and Wildlife Service, a fellow named J. Ding Darling. Now, Darling was an odd duck himself. He was a nationally syndicated editorial cartoonist for the Des Moines Register, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for his cartoons in 1924 and 1943. He was also an avid hunter, fisherman, and conservationist, and he was becoming alarmed at the loss of wildlife habitat and the possible extinction of many species. As an early pioneer of wildlife conservation, Darling worked this theme into his cartoons and helped influence the nation about the new conservation movement. In 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt appointed Darling as the director of the Biological Survey, the forerunner of my organization, the Fish and Wildlife Service. In his 18 months as director, Darling began the federal duck stamp program. He designed and drew the first duck stamp, and he vastly increased the acreage of the National Wildlife Refuge system. Because of Darling, since 1934, over $750 million in funds have been raised, and more than 5 million acres of habitat were purchased, primarily for birds, migratory birds, ducks, and so on. Also, if you go to a wildlife refuge, Darling designed the Blue Goose logo that you'll see if you visit any of our wildlife refuges. I should go back. This is kind of a fun cartoon Darling did during the New Deal. He was trying to come up with a symbol for bird conservation, and he came up with this little mallard in the corner, which is called Dr. Duck. And Dr. Duck restoration is basically President Franklin Roosevelt as a mallard. It didn't catch on. Instead, his blue goose became a more popular symbol for wildlife refuges. Now, Darling, as an avid fisherman and no fan of Midwest winters, knew the charms of Florida, and he purchased land on Captiva Island in the late 1930s. And in May 1942, he actually built a fish house out there. It's kind of an interesting house. You can still visit it today, and the dock was built with a counterbalanced drawbridge that he'd pull up behind himself to work uninterrupted on his cartoons. Darling found the fish house to be a sanctuary, pulling up the drawbridge to be secluded, and began to wonder about the viability of this great bird migratory island on the Atlantic flyway. Darling was instrumental in efforts to block the sale of a parcel of environmentally valuable land to developers on Sanibel Island. At Darling's urging, President Truman signed an executive order creating Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge in 1945, and that refuge was renamed in 1967 in honor of the pioneer conservationist, Ding Darling. The refuge today is actually one of my favorites. I try to visit it whenever I can, ideally in winter, but it consists of over 6,400 acres of mangrove forest, submerged seagrass beds, cordgrass marshes, and West Indian hardwood hammocks. Approximately 2,800 acres of the refuge are designated as wilderness area, and the refuge was created to safeguard and enhance the pristine wildlife habitat of Sanibel Island, to protect endangered and threatened species, and to provide feeding, nesting, and roosting areas for over 245 species of birds. Once again, just like parts of the Everglades, Sanibel, Captiva, these places were saved just in the nick of time. Florida was also at the epicenter of another critical piece of legislation. Just as they were at the epicenter of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Lacey Act, they also were a major spur for the very first Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Preservation Act of 1966 was the first tentative law created to make an endangered species list and to begin the first preliminary steps to protect endangered species. If we look back at this very first list, prominent on it were many native Floridians, including the American alligator, loggerhead turtles, key deer, and manatees. The manatees and alligators rebounded quickly from this protection, giving Americans hope we could remedy at least some of our earlier mistakes. All of these species were represented and protected by Floridian refuges. And since I've been so focused on Florida, I just feel like I have to make a caveat here. I am not a paid employee of the Florida Tourism Bureau, but I'm a big fan of Florida's environmental work. Now, all these refuges are places of great natural history, and they also have an important cultural history. And that's one thing I'd like you to take out of this talk. You know, we talk a lot about the natural history, and I'm going to talk about that. And of course, you're an Audubon Society, so you're interested in that. Your next talk is going to be on birds, but all of these places also have great cultural history. So let me try to share or combine the two as we look at some of these. So one of the species first to be protected under the Endangered Species Act was the American alligator. Hard as it is to believe today in Florida, American alligators were on the verge of extinction. They were being hunted ruthlessly for their hides. They were just about eliminated by the mid-1960s, and it probably was the iconic species brought back by the Endangered Species Act. Although what we tend to think of are things like bald eagles and so on. The American alligator was actually our first endangered species success story. This alligator ties back to my earlier story. He is a pretty famous alligator who sits beneath a bridge at the Nature Tour tram stop at the Darling Refuge that I showed you before. So it's like he knows he's protected there, and he's going to give a wildlife trail some verisimilitude by walking across it. And when Deb and I were talking about wildlife loops and wildlife trails before, the one she mentioned probably gets more human visitation, but of course in Fish and Wildlife Service, we're going to count gators and any other piece of wildlife that crosses it. So we'll boost our numbers that way. Another species being protected that was on the edge of extinction in the 1960s were loggerhead turtles. Once again, not something we normally think of predominantly with the Endangered Species Act, but loggerhead turtles were nearly extinct in the 1960s through a variety of pollutants and fishing nets. The Archie Carr National Wildlife Refuge stretches about 21 miles between Melbourne Beach and Wabasso Beach along Florida's east coast in Brevard and Indian River counties. The refuge was established in 1991 and named after the late Dr. Archie Carr Jr., pictured here, in honor of his extraordinary contribution to sea turtle conservation. This is one of my favorite photos because it looks like he's attaching a balloon or something. It's actually a buoy. They were trying to track loggerhead turtles, find out where they laid their eggs, and then create refuges there, like the Archie Carr Refuge, to try to protect them and bring them back. Carr was a graduate of the University of Florida, eventually became a pretty famous professor there, somewhat of a legend among the students for his conservation ethos and for his field work on turtles. The refuge is a direct result of Dr. Carr bringing attention to the world's declining turtle populations due to overexploitation and loss of safe habitat. People just didn't know how endangered they were until Dr. Carr, and now there's a famous refuge named after him in Florida. The refuge obviously was designated to protect habitat, and it became the most significant area for loggerhead sea turtle nesting in the world, not just in the US, in the world, and the most significant area for green turtle nesting in North America. 20 to 35% of all loggerhead and green sea turtles nest in the US. So it's really important refuges like the Carr Refuge protect these endangered sea turtles. Another species at risk that was on the early endangered species list was the key deer. And once again, we keep coming back to these same characters. Here's another Ding Darling cartoon. And the fact is, unregulated hunting had brought the population of key deer to an all-time low by the late 1940s. In the late 1940s, there were about 50 key deer left in North America. Public interest in the small deer had been pumped up by Ding Darling's political cartoons, and by the 1950s, the Boone and Crockett Club donated $5,000 to hire Jack Watson as a warden to protect the few remaining deer. Kind of a throwback to what the Audubon Society did when they hired their own private wardens. Watson, like Darling, was kind of a unpredictable future conservationist. He was actually a funeral home director and an ambulance driver in Miami. He had joint law enforcement commissions eventually from Florida and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And he had an imposing physical presence, a loud voice, and a no-nonsense manner when dealing with poachers. He soon became a U.S. game agent for Fish and Wildlife Service, and his territory covered more than 1 million acres, from the Marquesas Keys north and east, including the Everglades. Then finally, in 1954, 3 years before a key deer refuge was established, he was appointed to lay out the boundaries for it, and eventually a new refuge came about in 1957. He was the first refuge manager there, a position he retained till his retirement in 75. And there's all sorts of stories about him, including at one point chasing a poacher up a flagpole. I'm not going to go into those, but he was quite a character, the type of which we don't see much anymore. As the Florida Keys continued to develop, cars became as much a threat to the key deer as poachers, and Watson often took injured deer into a pen at his home to nurse them back to health. During Watson's tenure on the refuge, the key deer population grew to about 300 from 50, and others built on his efforts, and the population now is about 1,000 of these very unique deer found only in the Florida Keys. Finally, the last species, one everybody associates with Florida, are of course manatees. Manatees are protected at the Crystal River National Wildlife Refuge, established in 1983. It's pretty unique. It's the only refuge created specifically for the protection of the threatened Florida manatee, a subspecies of the West Indian manatee. This unique refuge preserves the last unspoiled and undeveloped spring habitat in Kings Bay, which forms the headwaters for Crystal River. The refuge preserves the most important aquifer-fed spring havens in Kings, which provides critical habitat for manatee populations that migrate there each winter. The refuge and other manatee conservation numbers have allowed this marine mammal to begin recovery, with more than 8,800 manatees now calling Florida home, not even counting all the manatees on your license plates, which are ubiquitous. The other unique thing about manatees is for decades, manatees had their own law enforcement officers. They were called manatee officers, and their job was to protect this marine species up and down the Florida coast. So Florida's played a critical role in the environmental movement. Florida helped start what became the National Wildlife Refuge System, and today there are 567 national wildlife refuges protecting more than 150 million acres of land and 600 million acres of marine ecosystems in every state and territory of the U.S. So that's 750 million acres, which is huge. There's no system like it anywhere else in the world where wildlife comes first. Its primary role is to protect migratory birds and other species of endangered and threatened wildlife. There are 31 national wildlife refuges in Florida. Here's the famous Rachel Carson, who worked for my agency for 16 years. And when she wanted to write her books about the oceans, her 3 bestsellers, where did she go? She went to Florida. Here she is in the Florida Keys in 1952. So like I said, 31 national wildlife refuges in Florida, and they protect some of our most endangered and iconic American species. And I also mentioned they have a cultural history behind them. There's a reason refuges are named after Archie Carr and Ding Darling. One of the most historic refuges is one you might not have had a chance to visit yet, or you might have. It's a fair distance away from you guys in Florida, but it's Egmont Key. And it's probably the most historic refuge in the area, if not in all of Florida, and one of the most historic refuges in the U.S. It became a National Wildlife Refuge in 1974, and it's managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect the island's diverse natural, cultural, and historical features. It's also cooperatively run with the Florida Park Service as Egmont Key State Park, and you can only get to it by taking a ferry. It's on the National Register of Historic Places because it played a prominent role in Florida's Seminole Wars, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. Here's an image from Fort Dade during the Spanish-American War. Situated at the mouth of Tampa Bay, this remote 200-acre island preserves the remains of historic Fort Dade and has a still functioning 100-year-old lighthouse. So here's another image of Fort Dade during World War I, when it was a busy military base. And here's the lighthouse, one of the oldest in the U.S., built in 1848. And then, after a bad hurricane, they rebuilt it 90 feet inland, which seemed like a prudent thing to do, as the bottom third of the lighthouse was actually underwater during the hurricane. So they basically took it apart and moved it 90 feet inland, and it's been there ever since. It also, in addition to having all this historic features, like so many of the refuges, it provides important habitat for nesting sea turtles, gopher tortoises, and over 30,000 nesting pairs of birds and other wildlife. You know, I like Egmont Key because it's typical. A lot of our most recent refuges have been previously used as military bases or industrial sites that are now being rehabilitated for wildlife and, of course, humans. So this might be one of the oldest ones, but it's fairly common these days for places that are no longer used for military sites or bombing sites to become a national wildlife refuge. We have refuges that have bunkers where ammunition was stored in World War II. We have refuges. We have a refuge in Texas where the very last battle of the Civil War was fought a month after Appomattox. All of this history is out there. Midway, the most famous site of the war in the Pacific, is now wildlife refuges for blue-footed boobies and goonie birds and albatrosses. So there's just a lot of cultural history with this natural history. So let me wrap up, as I've gone about 30 minutes on this brief journey through the important role of Florida in creating our wildlife conservation movement. So we began with a small 4-acre Pelican Island bird reservation in Florida, and from this has risen a giant wildlife archipelago across the continent and far into the Pacific. Florida has long been a destination point for avian and human migrants. The difference is that the human visitors can enjoy both the cultural and natural histories of these wild places as long as we continue to protect them. So thank you guys for your patience. I know presentations on Zoom and other virtual networks aren't quite as interesting as in person, and I dearly wish I could be with you all for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is I love Florida, basically. But I'd be happy to take any questions you might have at this point.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, questions. I see in the comments on YouTube the question, have you done much work with the grasshopper sparrow?
No. I'm sorry. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I haven't done much work with the grasshopper sparrow.
Is that a wildlife refuge, the Upper Everglades? Do you know the status of that project?
I don't. Is that being done at Loxahatchee?
Upper Kissimmee.
Oh.
That was going to be a wildlife refuge. That was, I don't know the status of it.
Now, Steve says I used to work on that island in 1978. Is Steve talking about Sanibel Island or Egmont?
Egmont. Talking about Egmont, which I've also had a chance to visit.
Oh.
Fabulous for the birds, and that was in June. I visited. But 78, was it, Steve? You can write your answers. Was it just beginning to build up? I understand the enforcement started pretty late after the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service took it over. What did you do on the island in 78, Steve? If you can answer quickly enough. Otherwise, we'll have to talk offline.
Well, Steve answers, used to be a Coast Guard person. Oh, very cool. And worked at that lighthouse. You know, people don't realize it, but we have lighthouses running from Maine through Virginia into Florida, that Fish and Wildlife Service, in conjunction with the Coast Guard, helps maintain. And it makes sense if you think about it. I don't know if you remember the slide I shared earlier, but there's 4 major migratory bird flyways, and Florida's on the Atlantic one. So a lot of the refuges, almost all of our Atlantic refuges, are on the coast. And so we inherit some very old lighthouses, including like Monomoy on Cape Cod, which is as old as the Egmont Key one. They had a life-saving station there. Now, the problem is, once again, this won't be new to Florida. A lot of our refuges, since they hug the coast, the wetlands, they're disappearing because of climate change. So what do? We have, say, 50 million acres of wetlands on the coast. We can't just pick them up and move them 9 miles inland, like we moved the lighthouse 90 feet inland. It's just, there's people there already. So we're really challenged. We're worried a lot of our wildlife refuges are going to get wetter. They may be inundated. They're going to get drier. They might get hotter. And then how are we going to keep the wildlife alive? It's hard. I mentioned it's an archipelago. Not all of our wildlife refuges are connected. They don't all have corridors, so it can be challenging for wildlife to move to these new places. So it really is going to be tricky for us.
How about Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge? Wasn't that also associated with a military, not military, space?
NASA. Yeah. Why do we have one of the weirdest things? So the first time I came to Florida, I was 18 and I really wanted to see NASA. And I was shocked. Before you get into NASA, you drive through a wildlife refuge, which back then had a little visitor center with, I think, a key deer in it, which is weird because there's no key deer at Merritt Island, a little stuffed deer. And then as we looked in the story, NASA, when it began, Cape Canaveral, wanted a buffer area. If you guys have watched that series on Disney called The Right Stuff and so on, it's very clear the early rocket tests and so on sometimes didn't go as planned. Sometimes they caught on fire. Nobody was really sure how big an area you could start a wildfire, a blast explosion. So they said, hey, let's stick a wildlife refuge around Cape Canaveral. And that's what Merritt Island is, basically. It's a giant buffer zone, but it's any place you put a fence and protect habitat fills up with wildlife in Florida. It's the most fertile wildlife state we have in the U.S. So it's turned out to be a wonderful wildlife refuge, and it's a great place.
We love it. So you can see these questions. Well, feel free to answer them as you wish. Terry says, you see that?
Yes. Are the National Wildlife Refuges having any trouble with too much use and too little funding? Not for the last year and a half during COVID, but it's a really good question. We always think we have too little funding. In particular, the historian is paid far too little. But in general, yeah, we wish we had more money for maintenance. We are, just in terrestrial acres, twice as big as the Park Service. And our agency only has 8,000 employees. So we manage 150 million acres of dry land, 600 million acres of waters. We have maybe a fourth the employees of the Park Service. Then we also manage the Endangered Species Act, the National Fish Hatchery System, federal wildlife law enforcement. We have all these functions, international wildlife trafficking. We protect rhinos and gorillas and that from being illegally poached, elephant ivory. So we're a small agency in personnel. So we have a big task with too few hands. We wish we had more people. As for visitation, we don't get the visitation of national parks. A lot of our areas are remote, like in Alaska and so on, but they tend to be very sensitive. So our challenge has been, how can we share wildlife with people and not disrupt it? We showed you sea turtle nesting sites. Sea turtle eggs are notoriously fragile and can be damaged. Birds, if they get scared, won't roost and lay eggs. So what we've started to do is create a lot of critter cams, wildlife cams, including where I work at NCTC. We have an eagle cam way up 150 feet in the air on a branch right above a pair of nesting eagles that have been there since 2003, actually, building this huge eagle nest. The eagle nest is so big, when we go to adjust the camera, we stand in it. It's 8 feet wide. It's 8 by 5 feet. It's just a huge nest. Eagles are kind of like Home Depot's best customers. They keep adding to their nest every year until it becomes this giant monstrosity, and then eventually the branch breaks, is usually what happens over time. So we're using these cameras to allow people to enjoy wildlife without disturbing it. The eagles don't seem to care that we're spying on them nonstop. In fact, there's 2 eaglets in there this year. If you haven't seen it, I strongly recommend going to visit the NCTC. That's where I work, the National Conservation Training Center, Eagle Cam. It is super fun. We put in 2 cameras. They move up and down if the eagles move around. They even have sound and night vision. Those poor eagles, they get no privacy at all. But they actually, it's amazing what they eat. A couple years ago, they took a whole groundhog up there. Now, the eagles didn't kill the groundhog. Some car did. They had 3 eaglets that year, and they were so hungry, and it was so hard for the parents to feed them that they started taking some pretty big prey up there. They just couldn't keep up with trout from the Potomac River and so on. So we're really doing that. You know, Terry, another thing we're doing is we're increasingly building refuges in urban areas, which seems weird. Like we have a refuge right next to the airport in Denver. We have a refuge right in Philadelphia. We have a refuge right in San Francisco. And we've taken former industrial sites where there might be pollutants in the ground you wouldn't want people to live, and make them into a wildlife refuge. My favorite is a place in Denver. So this may apply. If you ever go through the Denver airport, rent a car, get an Uber, and it's a quick drive to something called Rocky Mountain Arsenal. The Rocky Mountain Arsenal was the EPA's first Superfund site. Terribly polluted. They made chemical weapons, they made DDT, and they pretty cavalierly dumped it all over the place. And the city of Denver eventually shut them down. And it was cleaned up because it was a threat to the water supply, but you didn't really want people to live there necessarily. So they fenced it off. And this, literally, you can see the Denver skyline in the background. This refuge has a wild herd of bison. It's got a bunch of eagles. It has endangered black-footed ferrets. It's a wildlife oasis in view of the spires of downtown Denver. And it's kind of a success story. Just like the key deer and the manatees and so on, these species are coming back. And it doesn't all have to be doom and gloom. We're very worried about invasives. Once again, I could have talked about Florida and invasives forever, and climate change, but we've overcome other challenges. You know, that Lacey Act I mentioned, one of the things it banned was invasive species way back in 1900, which was pretty forward looking if you think about it. But what it didn't imagine was people would evade the law or bring in pets and then throw them in the Everglades and become giant snakes and other things that we deal with. All right, I see some other questions. I do not know about the Marjorie Harris Carr Greenway.
David, that's a state facility.
Okay. Yeah, we mostly manage national wildlife refuges, although the truth is, when we ask visitors where they've been, they never know if they're on a park or a refuge or a state park. It's all just a nature preserve to them. And then here's a great question from Susan. As more people are birding, hiking, and camping, do you see conflicts with using national wildlife refuges for hunting? Really good question. So most national parks, you can't hunt, right? In most national forests, you can hunt. Wildlife refuges are kind of split. We call it the multiple use challenge. So about half of our wildlife refuges you can hunt, most of them you can fish on, and it's really a delicate balancing act. So every refuge is set up with a purpose. and its purpose is always environmental. It's to protect a bird or a turtle or a manatee. Then other activities are allowed as long as they don't adversely impact the primary purpose. So to give you an example, we have a bald eagle refuge in Maryland, not far from me. And the bald eagles nest there, and an endangered squirrel called the Delmarva fox squirrel nests there. But we do a lot of waterfowl hunting there. And the hunting of the waterfowl, which is done in a different place than the bald eagle nests are, and they don't shoot squirrels, doesn't really impact the primary purpose of the refuge. So it's allowed there. There's other refuges, like for California condors, a very skittish bird. There's only a couple hundred in the wild, where we don't allow hunting. If they get scared, they don't lay eggs, and the species could die out. So we do multiple use. Interesting thing is, the refuges did not allow hunting till the duck stamp was passed in 1934. The idea was, well, we'll breed up all these animals, and if people want to hunt them, they can hunt them on private lands or state lands or national forests or whatever, but we'll just breed them up. But when we started getting hundreds of millions of dollars from hunters to buy up habitat and preserve habitat, it seemed only fair to allow more hunting on the refuges. Basically, they were buying the refuges for us. So we thought it was just equitable to allow them to do that. But it is challenging. You know, Teddy Roosevelt is famous as being a hunter, but he also was an avid birder. And we like to think we kind of embody his dual interests. You know, everybody knows Roosevelt shot a rhino and an elephant in Africa, and he liked to hunt out west. But a lot of people don't know he kept a bird list the entire time he was in the White House. He listed every bird he saw in Washington, D.C. When he was president between 1901 and 1909. And many of those birds are still there, not all of them. So we just like to say the refuge system kind of embodies Roosevelt's multiple interests. And because of that, we've had a broader constituency, but it's been controversial.
I just wanted to say that the birders can buy duck stamps, and they're really pretty, through the American Birding Association, and then they can track that effort. They're just $25, and they're really pretty.
Oh my God.
The one this year is a black-bellied whistling duck, which is, you know, one of the ducks around here. It's
the longest running federal art program in the U.S. We had a duck stamp contest. I was a junior duck stamp judge for kids, which was really fun. And we have some of the original paintings where I work, and they're gorgeous. I mean, once again, it's a great invention. People that love birds, 98 cents out of every dollar of the duck stamp goes directly to purchase habitat. And like I said, millions and millions of acres, really in the duck breeding grounds, a lot of them in the upper Midwest and the South, where there wasn't public domain land, like there was in Alaska and so on. Wherever ducks breed and feed and overwinter, and it's just great. And they're beautiful works of art. In fact, Ding Darling held a duck stamp contest for the 75th anniversary because Ding Darling drew the first one. He drew the first one on, some of you that are older might remember when dry cleaning had a little piece of cardboard that came on the hanger to keep it up. Well, they needed a duck stamp. They said they didn't have a drawing. He took one of these hangers out of his closet, drew a mallard, two mallards landing in a pond, and they made it into the first duck stamp. I mean, the guy was really talented and really fast. This is a great question. Nathaniel Reed, I had the pleasure of knowing him. He was a great Florida conservationist, a great national conservationist, wrote actually the best history of our agency. A great guy, really a huge proponent of the National Wildlife Refuge System. And I think we're either naming or have renamed a Florida refuge after him. I don't know if that's happened yet. Communication hasn't been as great during COVID. But I expect there'll be a Nathaniel Reed wildlife refuge in Florida really soon. The guy loved wildlife and really promoted the Endangered Species Act, wildlife habitat, pretty interestingly, equally strongly at the state level as at the federal level. Just a huge giant that should be better known at the national level. And I love this one from Steve. What can the average citizen scientist do to help our organization? Boy, bird counts. They become so easy now with this thing called eBird and so on. That's really wonderful. There's also, it's been a long day. I started at like 5 this morning, so I'm trying to remember.
iNaturalist?
No, I was trying to remember the phenological site, when things start to bloom too. We use that, when the first flowers bloom, the first trees bud, and so on. There's all of these citizen science naturalist sites for when you see birds, Christmas bird count, eBird, and so on. Also when things start to bloom, because we use that to see how seasons might be changing and affecting migratory birds, and then we can prepare on the refuges for when they're going to come. There's all sorts of opportunities. Actually, on the Fish and Wildlife Service site, there is a website devoted to citizen science. The other thing you can do is 2 things. Tell your friends, your neighbors, your politicians that wildlife matters to you. Because if they don't hear it, they don't know it. And then I think the most important thing citizen scientists, naturalists can do is go outdoors and enjoy nature. We spend a lot of time, people like me, reading about nature or on computers or doing PowerPoints. But the one great advantage environmentalists have, as opposed to anti-environmentalists, is we can go outside and enjoy nature and take great pleasure in it. My passion is fly fishing, and I work on a river. So every day I get an hour lunch break and I go fishing. And I don't catch a lot of fish. Fly fishing in the Potomac is pretty much a challenge, to put it mildly. But I just like being on the water. The eagle is often fishing ahead of me and kind of making me look bad. The NCTC eagle catches 100 fish for every one that I do, and I release them. The eagle's probably catching the ones I release. But get outside, enjoy nature, visit a wildlife refuge, and most importantly, take your kids or grandkids to these places, because more and more our younger people tend to stay in places that have outlets for obvious reasons, and we risk losing a generation of younger people appreciating nature.
So what state has the most wildlife refuges? North Dakota?
Yes. Oh, somebody reminded me, Project Budburst.
Yeah.
Thank you. Way to go. That is a neat thing. North Dakota has the largest number of wildlife refuges.
Very cool ones, and important for ducks, right?
Beautiful. Best bird watching anywhere. And a lot of them were picked up by the duck stamp. And then also after the Dust Bowl, a lot of lands up there are pretty marginal for farming, but they're great. It's called the Duck Factory, basically. It's
the only thing about that is it's hard to find a place to stay.
It is. It's remote. I'm from the upper Midwest. I'm from Wisconsin. And it is remote, but it's beautiful. I will guarantee any wildlife refuge you go to, even if it's in downtown Philadelphia, it will have some of the best birding ever. And it won't be as busy because people don't really know what they are. Refuge sometimes makes people think they can't go there. It's isolated. But everybody's invited, and you will have a wonderful time. You'll be largely in solitude, and if you see anybody with this logo, they'd be happy to help you when you're there.
So when we were visiting the ones out west, there were new visitor centers, and the sign said paid for with stimulus funds. This was Obama-era stimulus funds. So lots of those were out there. That was a big influx.
Yeah. It used to be, those old refuges like Jack Watson and those guys down at Key Deer Refuge. Well, the idea used to be put up a fence, put up some signs, kind of like Paul Kragel's U.S. Reservation Keep Off. And then if people wanted to come in and look at birds, fine, but they were on their own. We wouldn't even give you a toilet or a place to park or a picnic table. The big controversy in the 50s was, can you put one picnic table or one toilet on a refuge? And that was the attitude. That's for wildlife and so on. Then somebody remembered what Darling taught him. Wildlife doesn't vote. It can't support you. So our big push now has been education and visitor centers to orient people when they come. What type of birds or wildlife am I going to see? Maybe I need to use a restroom. I have kids. What type of hike can we do that might not be too arduous? More likely too arduous for the parents and the kids, whatever. So the visitor centers are pretty new to us. And actually, one of my jobs is if there's any history at all at the refuge, to try to do some interpretation of that too. So here you are at a refuge. Maybe there was like in North Dakota and so on. Some of our refuges are the sites of old forts. Some are the sites of important Native American sites. Some of our refuges now have Native American traditional tribal names next to the English anglicized names for lakes and things. So you can kind of learn some cool new facts. And yeah, they're everywhere. Every state has them. And
can you mention any more that are favorites of yours besides the Florida ones that you talked about?
Sure, I'll tell you all my favorites.
Okay.
Do you have another hour? No. No, it's if you like to fish or whale watch, or see old lighthouses, Cape Cod has a beautiful one called Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, and seals. It's full of seals, and because it has so many seals, it's actually has an occasional great white shark too. Going there to eat. That's a beautiful one. If you come up to Virginia, I think one of the real jewels is called Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge. Right on the ocean, you can actually you can camp on the beaches. It's connected to a national park called Assateague, and Chincoteague is really interested. Some of you might have remembered a kid's book called Misty of Chincoteague. They have wild horses on this refuge that every year swim from the island to the mainland, and then the fire department sells the horses to people that want to have Chincoteague ponies. It's actually got a unique deer from Japan called Sitka deer that were introduced there accidentally, and it's a gorgeous refuge. And then if you go to Patuxent Refuge in Maryland, right outside of DC, that's where the whooping cranes were brought back, and they have a wonderful visitor center. And then in DC is a place called Mason Neck. You might have heard of George Mason University. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. It's right outside of DC, and it's a beautiful bald eagle refuge. It was the first refuge for bald eagles. There's all sorts of bald eagles there, and it's a neat story. When the refuge was created, there were no bald eagles, but we had a diary from George Mason in the 1770s saying, I have a farm here, but all the damn bald eagles keep on eating all my crops and all my livestock. So that same location, we were like, well, maybe if we put a refuge here, maybe bald eagles will come back. This was in the 60s at the height of DDT and bringing back endangered species. And sure enough, now there's a bunch of nesting pairs there. If you see a bald eagle in the DC area, odds are it came from Mason Neck. So there's all these fun stories. If you're in an urban area, there's a great one called John Hines, named after the ketchup air in Philadelphia. That's right in town. If you're in San Francisco, there's a wonderful one in San Francisco Bay, also San Diego. There's just great ones. But my favorite by far is just off of Fort Myers on Sanibel Island. I think Ding Darling Refuge is just a real jewel. It's a beautiful island. Just south of it is Captive Island, half of which is in conservation. Beautiful visitor center, great programs. A little wildlife tram if you're traveling with people who don't want to hike as much and still want to see the gator. It's really a wonderful place. And then Pelican Island is very close, and they have an amazing boardwalk. Remember I mentioned there were 567 refuges? This boardwalk has a plank for every refuge in the U.S. in chronological order. So it starts with the very first refuge at Pelican Island. Really, the first 10 or so are Floridian refuges, and then brings you up to the most recent refuge, which I'm not sure where number 567 is. But there's just some really great refuges. And we have a little passport book. If you are going to visit refuges, you can get stamped, which is kind of fun. And I always forget to bring it with me, but it is really fun. So please go visit a wildlife refuge. They're all free too. so that's a bonus. Or mostly. A few have small fees for parking or something, but they're by and large free.
Wonderful. Any more questions, guys? All right then.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This was fun. Once again, I'd rather do it in person, but this was great, great audience, great questions. Sounds like you guys are doing a lot of wonderful stuff yourself and have great experiences. And maybe I'll see you at a wildlife refuge someday or at a duck stamp contest or anything else.
The last thing I was going to ask you was, can we visit your museum there?
Absolutely. We have, all right, let me put in a plug for us. So the National Conservation Training Center is 60 miles west of Washington, D.C. in West Virginia. And it lies along the Potomac River. It's got a wonderful museum. I just redid the whole museum this year. I took advantage of COVID to redesign the museum. We have 500,000 objects in the museum, everything from letters that Teddy Roosevelt wrote. We have Rachel Carson's typewriter. We have Paul Kragel's shotgun and boat and everything else. It's just an amazing. We have a polar bear specimen that from the first expedition to the North Pole. It's just an amazing museum, an amazing archive. So if any of you guys are in the DC area and want to visit NCTC, just let me know and we'll give you a personalized tour. So it's Mark Madison. I'm online everywhere. It's just Mark_Madison.
Mark_Madison at
FWS.gov.
FWS.gov.
So now you know how to contact me. Yep, that's it. I didn't even give you an alias. And I would love to show you the place, and I think you would really, really enjoy it. It's quite a special place.
Well, thank you. You can see your love of it all, and you do a great job. So thanks for coming.
Well, thanks for the invite.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to end the broadcast. Good night.